Now that we've talked about narration in general terms, let's apply that information to everyday use. A short story written by Alice Walker and published in 1973. Everyday use begins with Mrs. Johnson standing outside with her daughter as the two of them wait for Dee, Maggie's sister, to arrive. Mama fantasizes about being on a television program. We also learn that Maggie has been disfigured in a fire years before. Eventually, Dee does arrive, dressed in bright clothing and with a companion, a man whose real name we never learn. It's clear from the man's greeting, his name, and his dietary preferences that the man is a black Muslim. We also learn that Dee has changed her name to Wangaro, which is fairly typical of the times. Malcolm X did the same thing to signify that African Americans don't always know their original last names. But back to the story. After greeting her mother and sister, Dee proceeds to take photographs before entering the house. They all eat dinner and Dee talks nonstop. After dinner, Dee begins to admire various artifacts in the house and asks her mother if she can have them. The answer is always yes. That is, until she asks for a set of handmade quilts that she had refused in the past. This is the climax of the plot. Mrs. Johnson tells Dee that the quilts have been promised to Maggie, but that Dee can have one of the machine-made quilts. Dee becomes very upset and tells her mother that it would be a mistake to give the quilts to Maggie, because Maggie would probably put them to everyday use, hence the title of the story. Dee, on the other hand, says she would display and preserve the quilts. Maggie overhears the argument and says that Dee can have the quilts, but Maggie's generosity triggers an epiphany for Mama, who resolves the conflict by snatching the quilts from Dee and shoving them into Mama's hands. At this point, Dee and her companion prepare to leave, but not before she tells Mama that Mama doesn't understand their heritage. As Dee and her friend leave, Mama and Maggie sit outside just enjoying. The way that I have related the plot is as a third-person objective narrator, but this is not the kind of narration that Walker uses. Remember that to analyze narration, we should ask two questions. First, who is telling the story? In this case, the events are related by Mrs. Johnson, a character in the story, so this is first-person narration. Second, we should ask, should we trust this narrator? Now, that's a much harder question. The majority of critics believe that Mrs. Johnson is a biased but reliable narrator. Clearly, she does have a biased and ambivalent attitude towards her children. For example, she respects Maggie's knowledge of family history, but at the same time, she compares Maggie to a lame dog and describes her as having a kind of dopey hangdog look. She has the same conflicting attitude towards Dee. At one point, she admires Dee's appearance, telling us her feet were always neat-looking, as if God himself had shaped them. But at the same time, she tells us that she often fought off the temptation to shake Dee. And she repeatedly mocks Dee, taking delight, for example, in Dee's loss of a boyfriend. Because of these inconsistencies, many critics conclude that Mrs. Johnson is biased but reliable. I tend to see Mrs. Johnson differently. In fact, I vigorously disagree with those critics. In papers that I've published and presented at conferences, I argue that Alice Walker intends for us to recognize Mrs. Johnson as an unreliable narrator. First of all, she is a first-person narrator, so we know from the start that her account is one-sided and limited. Second, Mrs. Johnson likes to create fantasies. We know this because she has a fantasy of being on television, and in that fantasy, nearly everything is a lie. Now, many people fantasize, but most people keep at least one part of the fantasy realistic. No part of Mrs. Johnson's fantasy is true, which makes me wonder, if she's lying to herself, could she also be lying to us? Third, Mrs. Johnson doesn't have the personality or the experience to be a critical thinker and to draw correct inferences. She even admits this to us multiple times. She tells us, for example, that her school closed down, but that she never asked why. Later, she wonders if Dee and her friend are married, but she says she was reluctant to ask. And she even wonders if Dee's friend is a barber, but she doesn't ask that either. Obviously, she does not have the personality to dig deep for details. Likewise, she doesn't have diverse experiences. She seems to have lived her entire life at her homestead. In fact, her one big adventure seems to have been to walk 1.5 miles to a nearby farm. Finally, Mrs. Johnson tells us things that don't appear to be true or complete. According to Mrs. Johnson, Dee will never bring a friend home to visit, yet that's precisely what she does. Moreover, she is never even able to tell us Hakima Barber's real name. Therefore, because she is a character in the story, because she is biased against her children, because she creates fantasy worlds, because she doesn't ask questions, and because she presents incomplete or false information, I argue that Mrs. Johnson is an unreliable narrator and that the author deliberately created her this way. Perhaps you disagree. You might ask then, what does the story gain by having an unreliable narrator? For one, it causes the reader to dislike Dee. Mrs. Johnson clearly dislikes Dee on some levels, and she influences us to do the same. Most students who read Everyday Use leave it disliking Dee. I like it, but I like Dee. I admit that she is flawed, she's self-centered, but so are many people. I believe that readers dislike Dee, in part because of some of her actions, but primarily because Mrs. Johnson's narration creates bad feelings towards Dee. Think about it. Before we ever even meet Dee, we meet Mrs. Johnson, who poisons us against her. And by the time we finally do see Dee, we're already agitated, and we are only able to see her through her mother's resentful eyes. Imagine how differently we would think of these characters if Dee narrated the story, or even if Maggie did. So why does Walker want us to initially dislike Dee? Perhaps it's less about Dee and more about what Dee represents. Dee is, in many ways, like Alice Walker herself. Walker grew up in rural Georgia. Like Maggie, she was injured as a child when her brother shot a BB into her eye, causing her to become blind in that eye. Like Dee, Walker left home to go to college, and while in college, she probably met many black nationalists like Dee, people who were newly embracing their ethnicity by wearing braids or afros, changing their names, and collecting artifacts of their heritage. But I suspect that Walker wants us to think critically about African American heritage. What is the proper way for people to honor the past? By using objects in the way they were originally intended to be used? Or should we preserve these objects? There are probably merits to both sides of the debate. There's so much more to say about this short story. Critics write about the symbolism of the quilt and how it represents the ability of black mothers to take scraps and leftovers and create practical yet beautiful products and families. We could also discuss whether Mrs. Johnson is a static or dynamic character. However, the purpose of this discussion was to focus on point of view. I'm sorry. I hope you are able to see how Walker's decision to tell the story from the mother's point of view influences our understanding of other elements, and it influences our understanding of character and theme. In conclusion, point of view is an important element of fiction. When discussing a short story, you should be able to identify the type of narration as one of the 4 categories. You should also be able to recognize special cases of narration when you encounter them. You should also be able to ask and answer 2 fundamental questions about narration. Finally, you should be able to talk or write about whether a narrator is reliable and how narration influences other aspects of the story. This has been a lecture on point of view and everyday use. Thank you for listening.